All right, we are live. I'm excited today to be talking to Stephen Chan, who's the Senior Director in Asia for PayPal. So, welcome, Stephen. And yeah, look forward to our conversation.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we'll just kick it off by describing the what we were talking about a little bit pre-show, but how has COVID changed maybe the trajectory of what you were thinking about in terms of future planning at PayPal in Asia? And then if you could just highlight for me, like where does what's top of mind for PayPal in Southeast Asia uniquely? I'm curious to just paint that landscape for me.
I think all of us saw the acceleration in terms of digitalization and acceleration of digital payments coming pre COVID. And maybe the pace would have been the next 3 to 5 years. COVID has really shifted the landscape and compressed that into months. And so the past year, living with COVID, and all of us experienced this, right? Being locked down, and the only thing that we could do, not able to go on our daily lives, whether it's shopping, getting groceries, seeing friends, is to use the internet, e-commerce platforms to purchase our daily needs, right? And that has really accelerated digital payments and compressed that acceleration in a matter of a few months. And so this landscape has been very exciting for us, and we have seen the types of customers coming onto our platform that allow us to think innovatively about the different types of products and services we could offer. So, for example, pre-COVID, we've seen this trend of millennials and young people being more savvy with technology and using digital payments easily, whether it is P2P, like the Venmo product that we have in the US, or using various social media platforms for their e-commerce purchasing. What we have seen, at least last year, is that the large number of people who are coming into digital payments and the digital platform are the actually 50 and above people. We often forget that elderly people or older people um, who are not as savvy with technology, but when they are forced into a situation where they have to use it, they actually have really embraced it. And so what we call the silver tech has been really driving our customer base initially in the US. Here in Asia Pacific, it's a different story. We experienced the pandemic before the other regions, whether it's Europe or the US, and so lockdown started to happen in the different countries earlier on. And as the other regions have been hit with COVID, we have had a better management of it in terms of having a good playbook. And also, we experienced SARS, a few years back, and so there was a similar playbook that governments have been deploying for the COVID management initially. However, that all had to change. It also accelerated digital payments here, but it's differently than the US because the markets here are so fragmented and the landscape are not equal in the sense that in terms of infrastructure, in terms of levels of sophistication with technology and financial literacy. And so you see that mature markets such as Australia, uh, Japan, and elsewhere have really embraced digitalization and seen this shift. But also other areas where they're not as mature are embracing digitalization, but differently, more at a slower pace. However, I think the mindset has shifted. And that's one piece. The other is government realized the importance of digitalization as they are trying to quickly support communities and households that were impacted by COVID and the need to get stimulus, the needs to get funds to these folks. There was a huge gap because how do you get funds to these folks when they're not in the financial system? They don't have bank accounts, and when banks are shut down and places are locked down, there's no way for them to get the physical cash. And so governments also realize that there's a need for digitalization and shifting priorities to focus on that. So that's been really exciting in my role as head of government relations for PayPal in Asia Pacific. with my teams, working with many government stakeholders in the region, trying to help governments think it through on how do they look at SMEs, how do they look at consumers, and what kind of products and services that would be most useful, and bring in best practices from other regions to support these digitalization efforts.
Yeah. Did PayPal push out not stimulus checks? Maybe is that the right terminology? Did PayPal move money from government to individuals in Singapore?
No, we have not done that. Singapore is very mature in the sense that it is a population that is highly educated, highly connected. There are a number of payments platforms. The government has done a great job pre-COVID in setting up these payment networks and systems in place to allow fintechs, banks, non-financial institutions, tech companies to plug in with different products and services, different financial products and services to offer to the population. However, we have had similar experience in the U.S. where we participated in the government paycheck protection
Mm.
PPP, the
PPP
paycheck
is the
protection
easiest way to
program.
say it. Yeah.
Exactly. Where initially governments were looking to traditional financial institutions like banks to distribute these loans to businesses that were impacted by COVID. And we realized that in our network, we have a large community of small businesses, and because they're in our system for a long time, and we are able to provide a number of products and services, we were able to get the funds quickly to them. And so we work with the U.S. government, with Congress, with the administration to allow fintech to also participate, because in the US, it's a much more mature place for us, and we have a variety of credit products there as well. And so we understand how these SMEs operate. And so we're able to reach this network of micro small businesses that would have otherwise been bogged down by traditional banking regulations and requirements to get those funds. In Asia, I think it's a very challenging landscape in the sense that um, governments have various types of programs in place, and the different infrastructure to support those programs are different stages of development. But we are looking for ways to support this digitalization efforts. As the stage one, you need to get people digitalized. And then the second stage is then how do we think about using digital payments to support and scale their businesses, or getting them more familiar with financial services, financial products and services.
Yeah. What do you think people don't realize about either the Singapore ecosystem or Asia at large? Like, what do you think
Mhm.
that you've seen and learned from your experience? You've been at PayPal for a few years, but before that, you've been in working with governments in Asia and China, if
Yeah.
I believe, if that's correct, or no,
Yes.
with Office of China in the U.S. Maybe if you could just before you even get to that, can you just run through the
Sure.
most significant experiences of your career prior to PayPal?
Sure. You're right. I have a mixture of government experience and private sector experience. Previously, I was working in Washington, D.C. for a number of U.S. government agencies there, working on Asia trade issues. I moved to Asia about 8, 10 years ago, to China first, working for a trade association, and then to Hong Kong for 4 to 5 years, working for a bank, working with government and regulators on public policy issues, and moved to PayPal a few years back in this role. I think one thing that we need to be aware of when we talk about Asia Pacific is that it is not monolithic. There is no one size fits all solution. You've been to Asia, you know that it is very fragmented and different stages of development, at least in the financial services space, and different stakeholders and different citizens, different people in terms of their sophistication with technology and financial services products. And so when you and then Singapore is actually on the more advanced
Oh
side.
yeah,
And so when COVID hit, the government was very efficient in making sure that businesses that were impacted were given a number of support, whether it is through income subsidies or helping SMEs and small businesses with digitalization. So a number of government programs to provide fundings for infrastructure upgrades, provide funding and support for training, and also emphasizing the need for public-private partnerships. And so reaching out to tech companies, reaching out to various stakeholders to partner with the government to either help SMEs to digitalize, training SMEs, or thinking about helping the workforce transition to a more digital workforce as the economy is shifting to a more advanced, tech and digital economy, especially in the ICT sectors, the info, com, media, and technology, telecommunication sector. The other area in Asia, I think, that we find that has been challenging, it is around supply chain. I think we have seen that COVID has really shown a light on the supply chain challenges because although the region may be vast, there are a number of countries that are very close to each other. And when you have travels and economies shut down and they're so dependent on exports and imports and trade, people were kind of stuck and borders were closed, and it created kind of mass bottleneck
Yeah.
on that. And so I think there's a renewed focus on supply chain issues in the region. It's not an area that I have great expertise in, but it's certainly a hot topic here in the region.
And now, did you focus on that previously, or your work previously was more in the relationship between governments and private sector? So, do you think of it as previous to PayPal, you were working with governments to help them with advice and understanding private sector challenges? Is that approximately correct?
Right. I mean, in my current role as well, my role has always been in the working in the intersection of business and
Yeah.
public policies. So, how do we help regulators, government, and government organizations think about how do we bring in the best practices? How do we bring in the expertise as they think about policies and regulations for a variety of business sectors? Right? Either it is when I was in the bank, in the banking, financial services sector, now here at PayPal, in both the financial services sectors, but also in the tech sectors, in the payment space. As regulations and policies are coming out, I think it is important that industry need to communicate and work closely with government partners to help them to understand our products and services and also articulate some of the challenges that we face. So as they come up with new regulations, they keep those in mind. And also at the same time, so much changes are taking place every day, whether it's on the technology front, whether it is the market trends, and it is, when you deal with regulations and policies, they're pretty opaque, they're really technical. And once they are set, they're set for a number of years. And so how do you create that space in the in regulations and in policies that allow for growth and changes and not really hamstring the private sector and their economy from growing and from innovating? And so it is important to help them work through these complex issues, making sure that the right safeguards are in place, which is the concerns of policymakers, that there are safeguards in place to either protect consumers, to make sure that systemic risks are managed, to make sure that various controls are in place. At the same time, giving flexibility for businesses to be able to innovate, to be able to grow and support the government initiative. So finding that balance is critical, and the private sector and companies play a critical role in making sure that we provide those feedback, provide those best practices, giving them data, and as well as capacity building and training so that they are aware and that they have the most up-to-date knowledge.
Mm. Would you say that there's a common understanding? Because to me, it seems like uh, there's boundary conditions on this stuff, right? When you say you want to strike a balance, you're implicitly referring to the balance between two extremes. One being there's too much regulation and private sector companies can't innovate and they can't move. And so things get stagnant. There's not improvement. And by all means, we're stuck. And then if you have no regulation, then there's just what are the downsides of that? There's sometimes there can be corruption, there can be people doing things that are not for the betterment of the good. They're strictly looking out for profit and at the cost of everyday people. So there seems to be that's the balance between these two. There's a book actually I just finished reading that was really good by Matt Ridley called How Innovation Works, and he talks about this kind of this balance between uh, how regulation impacts private sector innovation, and it's something that had just been percolating on my mind very much recently. I'm curious your thoughts on how is either Singapore or Asia, whatever you feel most comfortable. How is that landscape different than the U.S. in terms of maybe its regulations as it pertains to finance or at large? But I'm curious because many listeners here will be familiar with the U.S. style regulatory culture, let's call it. I'm curious how does that what do you compare that to? Like how would you compare that to Singapore? What
Yeah.
contrasts are important?
I think when we talk about that balance that you just mentioned, it's also about trade-offs as well.
Yeah.
When you go to one extreme, what are the implications and what are you trading off, for a very highly regulated sector that may have, all the safeguards in place. And then the trade-off is that you may then become less competitive. You may attract less investment. You may create a climate that may not be conducive for innovation, etc. The other side is if you have such Wild West type of setting where free for all for the private sector, then you also create a lot of potentially kind of a risky environment where you know the rule of law may be weakened, or you don't have the right judicial systems in place, or you don't have the right processes in place, where it creates a lot of uncertainty for businesses, and that's also not good. You may not attract the right investment for multinational companies. That's not an environment conducive for growth and for innovation. And it's really hard to compare to the US because the US has a very different political and legal structure in place. You have the federal system, and then you have the state system. And the state, to some extent, have a lot of flexibility in terms of some of the commerce regulations, taxation, etc. And then in Asia Pacific, you have large, massive countries like China and India with many provinces and many states. And then you all have kind of a city state economy, or city or very small economy, where you have maybe just a handful of cities or a handful of provinces. And so in these smaller economies, whether it is Singapore, or you take other economies like Hong Kong and elsewhere, where then the government and regulators are very open to collaboration with industry, open to feedback, because they need that partnership in order to create that. Sorry.
Oh, keep going, keep going. I
Okay.
just had to turn the light on.
No, no problem. No, I think in a smaller economy, I think it gives the government a lot of flexibility to work with the private sector, to partner with private sectors, to make sure that they put out the balance regulations and the balance regulatory regime, because the impact to their economy is massive, right? If you have a handful of companies who are not happy and decide to leave, or you have companies who don't want to come into your economy, the impact is very great on the overall growth of your country, also your labor force. It impacts competitiveness, right? And so I think really depends on the size and the nature of that economy to have a very to look through the lens of that balance, that trade-off. Now, if you have massive countries like China and India, I think the approach is very different. You have different types of pressure and needs, and you have also a lot of domestic constituencies. And so then looking at those lens would be differently than a smaller country that is very dependent on business and foreign
Mm,
direct investment.
mm,
So I do think, when I talk to governments of different sizes of countries, regulators from different regions, I do look at it from a business perspective. What is the trade-off for the regulator, for the government, and how can then we, as an industry, help enhance that trade-off so that they see the business imperative for certain regulations, or helping them understand that there is an implication to certain policies and regulations that may not be helpful to their national interests, or very government priorities. And so really to find that alignment and bringing in the right type of expertise to help them understand and also potentially adopt some of those best practices, and just really working very closely with governments and regulators.
yeah. No, I mean, that all makes sense. I'm so curious about what's behind the scenes. What maybe something you've either suspected or seen that would be interesting from I think about like why do some governments do it better than
Mm,
others? It's clearly some seem to have their act together, and even that phrase, having your act together, doesn't necessarily imply better or worse. There's different spectrums, but countries also seem to ebb and flow. Like the U.S. will have certain they'll be on a pendulum of saying we're going to be very strict or very lenient, and these things kind of ebb and flow. And I think one of the things that the US did really well was they said early on the internet, we're just going to let it be fairly unregulated. And I think that was unanimously viewed now as a big part of why it was so successful in the US, more so than Europe. I mean, Amazon, Facebook, Google, there's not really major equivalent companies in Europe. And uh, a big part of what this book that I just read talked about is the regulations were tighter in Europe, so it's harder to get these companies off the ground. And I wonder if that's a factor. It has to be equally as much a factor in finance as it is in any other industry. Finance is also different because it's money. It's not just your Facebook pictures or something. It's something. It always feels like money and health are the two things we tie morality to. So
mm,
there's especially healthcare, but finance in particular, it's more than just any other commodity that you're trading. It's the government is intimately involved in this because if you do it wrong, there's major repercussions. And I think governments are probably concerned about revolt. If they don't have enough regulations and people lose their money, well, then there's going to be rioting in the streets. It's the kind of thing. Like if Amazon, for instance, if they shipped their boxes to the wrong place, people aren't going to be rioting in the streets saying, I need my protein bars or my headlamps. But finance is a different kind of thing because it very much moves the currency. It moves currency. Do you see to bring up crypto for a minute? Crypto, obviously, being that it's inherently decentralized, which is the main interest point. Does that I guess how does PayPal feel both defensively and offensively about crypto? Because there's certainly a opportunity to disrupt PayPal, but I'm sure PayPal views it as an opportunity to innovate and improve on the way that people access currency and use it. I'm curious how where does it pinch maybe PayPal in an existing area, and then how, because companies have to always evolve with when new technology comes around. It's not any flaw of PayPal's. It's like crypto changes a lot of things. But yeah, but I'm curious if you have initial thoughts on this, given that you probably think about it a lot.
Well, let me address the first part of your
Sure.
question. What is behind the scenes? I think, as I mentioned, in Asia, there's no one size fits all. There
Mm,
are different government and political systems here. You have democracies, you have communist countries and systems. You also have um, um, military coup regimes, right?
mm,
That's still in place. And so and so when we think about collaboration with governments and we think about that interaction, you have to be really nuanced. You can't really bring in the Western framework or approach to dialogue or engagement.
Mm,
I do think that governments here in general do appreciate insights, best practices, data, only if it's complementary and helpful to what they're doing.
mm,
I think, like any countries, they don't appreciate when we are guests in these markets. We're an American company. We're guests in these markets. I don't think they appreciate any foreign entities coming in dictating or telling them you need to do A, B, and C. But
mm,
I do think that as we think about how to align with the priorities, how to align with the growth, these best practices, insights, and data are important points for them to consider. And so when we approach engagement here in the region, you really have to have a tailored approach. You also have to be mindful of the local culture, the local legal system, even history as well, right? Because some countries are very sensitive to foreign intervention and all of that because of the colonial imperial colonization kind of background, and so they're much sensitive to that. And also, the stakeholders are very different as well, and so there is that element of nationalism, in these countries as well, like the U.S. as well, right? All countries are very nationalistic, especially during a crisis or when they encounter, certain issues and challenges, and so. We have to be really mindful, and so there is really no secret sauce around behind the scenes, but it is just being cognizant and being mindful of that nuance. Now, in your second question around crypto and digital assets, it is an area, it is an interest for PayPal, and our CEO and our senior executives have made it very clear. It is an as we launch crypto in the U.S. and bringing it out internationally, it is kind of the future digital payment transaction that you can't just ignore. And there are there are different forms of that being in development right now. You have the cryptocurrencies that are in the marketplace, but then you also have a government-backed digital assets, whether it is a form of a stable coin or in some form of a central bank digital currency. This is still in early stages. We're still working through some of our priorities and focus, but no doubt that we are definitely very interested in making sure that we work closely with regulators and governments in this space. And yeah, and I do think that it is a huge area of opportunity.
Nothing launched yet, though. I haven't been following PayPal's news closely, but they haven't pushed out anything crypto, no crypto products specifically.
Well, I mean, last year we enabled the PayPal wallet in the US to be able to transact in the four major cryptocurrencies.
Oh,
So you're able to trade, hold crypto in your wallet, and also Venmo now we enabled that as well.
mm.
And recently we brought this out international, launched this in the UK, and so yeah, that's what we have for now.
I love Venmo. And PayPal is great too, but Venmo in particular is so easy to use. Why is it only in the US because of the banking system? I mean, it seems like it would be something to roll out everywhere. I mean, are there obvious limitations to geography on Venmo?
I'm not very
Yeah.
involved in the product, development of this strategy, but we do recognize it's a very popular platform for us in the U.S., and it's one that we get a lot of new consumers, especially the millennials. It is very interesting that even sometimes when I talk about PayPal, people don't know that Venmo is part of the
Yeah.
PayPal network, and people say, "Yeah, I know, I know about PayPal, but actually, I use Venmo a lot for this and that." And I was like, "Well, Venmo is part of PayPal."
Yeah. Yeah. And you live in Singapore. How do you think about um I mean, back to the countries in Southeast Asia? You mentioned the nuance between the different countries. You lead Southeast Asia Pacific PayPal. How do you think about prioritizing those countries? I mean, do you look at it and say there's obviously the size of the country and the economy? So the
Yeah.
market size is an obvious factor. Probably the friendliness to you as an outsider, and then there's probably the stability of the banking system. Maybe are there other factors that are maybe less intuitive that you think about that have been surprisingly influential in how you
Yeah.
spend your time and growing in different places?
Absolutely. So I actually look after Asia Pacific, so a much bigger scope. So,
Yeah.
in about 15 countries, 15 economies actually. So it is very diverse from Australia to Japan, from China to India, and
Mhm.
all over Southeast Asia. And so that diversity, it is very important as I think about the engagement. But you're absolutely right. So first and foremost, it is around our business footprints. Where are we in these economies? And uh, our footprints are not the same in different
Mhm.
countries because exactly to your point, there are the difference in regulatory systems, the difference in infrastructure, and the difference in terms of consumer demands. And so with that, I have to then align kind of my engagement, my strategy with our business footprints, our business interests, and
Mhm.
what our business priorities are. So that's that one piece of it. The other is around risks. Where
Mhm.
are the areas that are not only volatile from a geopolitical perspective, because geopolitical risk is also part of my remit, but also as we think about the development of various regulations, where are as we have to be kind of future looking, forward looking in terms of what regulations on the horizons that may impact our business, our products and services in that country. And so that is more of a proactive kind of engagement, and has to be part of the strategy, because by the time those regulations are in place, it's too late. And so how
Mhm.
do we think about shaping those developments, how from a positions of bringing in best practices, but also articulating, as I mentioned earlier, some of the business imperatives, for or against, or some modifications of those regulations. So that managing that risks on the horizon is quite important. And then I would say, lastly, is around influencing and thought leadership. Where are the gaps as I think
Mhm.
as we think about the public private partnership, because as a multinational company, as a global company, I do think that, regulators and governments look to companies like PayPal and others for insights, for positions. So, for example, as a big fintech company, you will expect governments to come to us and ask for views on data. Right? How do we think about data
Mhm.
management of data, cross-border data flows, privacy issues? That you would imagine that they'll come and ask us, for views as they think about developing regulations around the digital wallet, e-wallet, things of that nature. And so I do think that having those positions, having those thought leadership in place, really enhance the partnerships, and really also position PayPal as a thought leader, as a go-to company for them to seek insight. And that's how we want to position in the space, especially in Asia Pacific, when there are so much diversity and so much nuances and so much constraints. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, man. I just think if I'm in your position, what do I do? What do I do in the morning? How do I prioritize? Because when you're overseeing that many countries, the US is big and it's complicated, but at least it's only one country. You're prioritizing across these different countries, and so you have to split your time somehow.
Yeah.
Um, how many people now report up into you, or how many people do you have generally working on the region?
I have about 12 people. So I do have a team in different markets, because you do need to have the local language, the local
Mhm.
expertise, the local understanding of that nuance, right? Because, even how the different ministries within that country, how they interact, the
Mm.
different legislations and policy making and how decisions are made are quite important. And so having that local talent and local insight is critical. So those teams are local, national, whether it's in Australia, Japan, or China, helping me in managing those engagements. But also we use external consultants,
Hmm.
contractors to help us as well, because massive markets, you just cannot have um, a large team in place. For example, in India, I have two staff in Mumbai, and in New Delhi. In India, I have staff in Beijing and Shanghai. But those are just two major cities. But you
Yeah.
think about a population of over a billion people, right? Any village is over a million, right? Easily. Any rural like town, right? When you think about in the US, like a small town is like hundreds or maybe a couple thousand. Here is in the millions, right? When you
Yeah.
think about a rural town
God.
in China and India. And so you can just imagine the coverage that's needed. So we do use some consultants and contractors to help us as well.
Yeah, boy, yeah, you're so right about the scale. It's just staggering. I haven't been to India. Like you said, I've been to Asia, a lot of Asian countries. I used to live in Singapore, but India, there's actually a really good map. I'll have to send it to you. It's like a topographical map, but it shows instead of the height being the land, it shows it being the population. So you can see these
Yeah.
towers basically, and you look in the U.S. and there's New York is big, Seattle's big, L.A. And then you go to India and it's just New York cities everywhere. And like you say, they're just enormous amount of people. Same with
Yeah.
China. And yeah, it's staggering. It's staggering. So for you to coordinate with these folks with having, only 12 people on the team, it's how do you measure your success? Is there North Star metrics, or is it more of a soft qualitative assessment
Yeah.
generally?
That's a good question. I get that a lot because
Yeah.
when you deal with government relations or government engagements, how do you measure relationships and how do you
Yeah.
measure outreach and engagements, right? It's very tough. I mean, certainly there are some quantitative measurements. You can think about how many meetings you have had, how many conferences you attend, how many officials you have hosted, right? But that is just a very small um, uh, piece of the picture. Relationships don't happen overnight. You have to constantly, we all are people. We are people that needs interaction and socialization, and so you have to really build that relationship through years of engagement, and also having a foresight of identifying who are the emerging leaders within the different governments and partnering with them, because although everyone are so captivated by the headlines and the leaders, whether it is Prime Minister Modi in India, head of states, cabinet members, but it is the staff level, the mid level that really are the ones who are coming out with
Mm,
strategies, policies, the technical development of these regulations. And it is that level you need to engage and making sure that they have, a holistic view
mm,
of the picture. And then as you engage with these mid-level officials, mid-level specialists, they also grow within the ranks of their government. And so you already develop that partnership, that credibility, and that
mm,
trust. And as they grow and go into different leadership positions, I think that's where then they see you as a partner, trusted partner, and that's how you can really enhance the engagement. And so as a publicly traded companies, we have quarterly earnings, we have yearly filings, and so people tend to look at the short-term kind of KPIs, but it is the longer term relationship that you cannot really measure, right? How do you measure, level of credibility and trust with somebody, right? And so
mm,
but when you build that relationship and able then to influence particular pieces of regulations or legislations, then that is one of the KPIs or the outcome of that. And secondly, regulations and policy making are very complex. They're very nuanced. They take time. There are various processes in place. It's not just you do something, it's done. You have to engage with various stakeholders. You can imagine, in the US, three branches of governments. You can pass, it takes a long time to pass a law. And then there are also other challenges, right, that people can
yeah.
pursue if they're not happy with the law. Similarly, here as well, there are different interagency play. There are different legal systems in play for input, etc. And so there's no finite. There's no clean beginning and
Yeah.
end, right? And so that process takes a while. And so then you don't see the results of your engagement, maybe 2 or 3 years later. And then how do you articulate that value that you bring to the organization, from 2 years ago when things were ready, we move
Yeah.
on to the next year. So I do think that articulating these relationships that are in place, the partnerships, and that engagement is a critical piece of my kind of measurement for
Yeah.
KPI. And then just lastly, we often don't measure um, uh, good news, right? And so when we help our companies, in my profession, prevent a crisis from happening, that really sometimes, okay, good, right? Because those crises that don't happen don't get measured, right? But when a crisis hit, and then you're able to address it, then that gets noticed, right? And so there are a number of, as I mentioned, the risk management is a critical piece of kind of my
Mhm.
work. And there are a number of initiatives and engagements that we are able to help through relationships, through best practice engagement, to prevent these risks from ever, emerging or lessen the risk. And that sometimes, we don't think about it, right? And it's only we think about it if there's a major issue, and then we prevent that. And so if you think about even in the U.S., right, when things are going good, things are going good. You don't really give credit to the people who make sure that things are running properly. But when something happens, whether you're not getting certain services or certain crises happen, then that becomes so evident. And then when you're able to address that, then that is kind of an acknowledgement that has been done. And so I also want to let my peers and others know that you do also have to measure these costs that we're able to help the company, prevent the company from happening. It's also an important piece of my work.
Yeah. I give you a lot of credit. I mean, I feel you may not even be fully aware of this, although you probably are, that you're by working at a publicly traded US company in finance and dealing with a ton of government countries, namely also China, India, major countries that often don't have the best relationship with the US, and it's all dynamic. You're kind of like you have to, you can't just say it straight, like if you're working at a 5-person startup, you can be just dead honest and this is what I think and critique the countries and critique people out left and right, but you represent PayPal, and so you have to be smart, but you also, when you work with countries, you have to be smart with how you talk to them. And I'm sure there's so much, God, the politicking, and I don't mean politicking in a negative way, but politicking in a way where you're relating to people, you're understanding what they want. Yeah, I'm really starting to get it, get what you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, because it very much is, the term tiptoeing. It's like you're kind of tiptoeing between different people and different groups. It's fascinating. I mean, it's amazing you can do it in the first place, because it is quite challenging. Um, Obviously, the political decisions of some countries, you can't comment on, and I wouldn't ask you to comment on. But are there things specifically, if you were to say, put a public service announcement out there in the domain of finance? So let's just carve out that and say, if people are listening and they're in Asia, but maybe they're in other parts of the world, and they're thinking about um, how do I go about either crypto or web-based banking or digital wallets? Do you have is there a philosophy that you generally, if
Yeah.
you get a dinner with someone, do you say, okay, this is what you got to know? And do you have a kind of a vision of the future that you try to um, convince people of, or inspire people to see your view?
I don't have a vision per se, but
Yeah.
I do have an approach, right? And I
Approach.
think
Yeah,
that
that's
approach,
probably a better word.
yeah, I think the approach is this, right? In Asia Pacific, when you think about financial services, the opportunities here, it's all about financial inclusion. You
Yeah.
have still a large segment of the population that are unbanked or underbanked,
Huge, right?
either not having the right type of products and services that are relevant to their everyday lives. And if you look around in the region, you have a high percentage of unbanked in India, in
Yeah.
China, and also in Southeast Asia. And you're talking about hundreds of millions of people here. And so already there is this massive market opportunity, and with any startup or small business coming in here, you have a segment of the population that you can really target with the right products and services and the right strategy. So financial inclusion, I would say, would be kind of the anchor as you
Mm-hmm.
think about the markets, as you think about also the opportunities. I think COVID has accelerated digitalization, which is a great thing because in many of these rural places or the unbanked populations, infrastructure, access to internet connectivity is a huge problem. If you don't have the right infrastructure in place to support that, it'll be hard for them to move from offline to online. And I do think that COVID has shed a light on that gap between urban and rural, those who are technically or digitalized and those who are not digitalized. And so now I think government is focused. A lot of private public partnerships are in place to help with that digitalization efforts.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that is not the whole story about financial inclusion. Then there are around the products and services. You can't just bring in the one size fits all, or usually many companies they bring in the urban type of products and services, very complex investment products, for example, or insurance that may not fit for a rural farmer or small business entrepreneur, artisans, for example, right in the streets. It may not fit for their needs, and so you have to think about more simple products that would help their
Mm-hmm.
everyday lives. And then lastly, it's around the financial digital literacy. So just because you have the infrastructure in place, you have the products and in place, it doesn't mean that they know how to utilize that. However, that's not to say that these unbanked or underbanked people are not intelligent. They're actually very sophisticated business people. They're just more comfortable dealing with cash, and it's
Yeah.
simply because of the situation that they're in. And many of these entrepreneurs, small businesses, have sustained themselves for years,
Yeah.
right? And so, but how do you then educate them in terms of the value of digital financial services, products and services that would help enhance, either their daily lives or their businesses, right? So that financial inclusion kind of approach have to be a holistic
Yeah.
approach. You look at the markets, you look at the populations, and then you look at what infrastructure are in place to support that.
Are people generally pretty is the main reason certainly there's the education portion, but are people skeptical of the government largely? Not to name any specific government, but just are they skeptical of governments when because cash in your hand, it's yours, no one can see it, no one can touch it. Um, Certainly there's ramifications for reporting taxes. People can choose not to report income from taxes that come in with cash. The government could, in theory, see digital transactions where they couldn't see cash. Is that a dominant thought for people when they're resisting moving to digital, or is that just one of many factors? I'm curious how that if that's. I'm trying to think of what are the other reasons people wouldn't move to digital. Yeah.
So I would think it's a combination of all of the above. I do think that the unbanked and the underbanked are not monolithic, right? You have
Hmm.
um, different generations within that population as well. You have certain populations that may have access or some access to digital or technology, digital devices or technology. For example, even though the number of unbanks are really high in Southeast Asia actually has one of the highest penetration in terms of mobile and
Yeah.
internet usage, right? In Asia Pacific and certainly in the world, the growth, and so I think a lot of it is just not being familiar with the products and services, and it also goes to the education system, and so they may not have very advanced
Mm.
education opportunities. They may not have training, easily accessible training, even in their own language, right? Because these folks live in provinces and outside with very different types of native dialect as
Mhm.
well, right? And so
Yeah.
sometimes there may not be targeted to support that. So there is that level of unawareness, or that level of not having a lot of exposure to it. That's one
Yeah.
piece of it. I do think the older population may have a little bit,
Oh yeah.
may be skeptical of technology, and they always think it's very safe to have cash. Certainly my parents
Oh yeah.
still have some of that, even have, even though they have bank accounts, etc., they still like to carry X number of cash in their pocket just in case, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, because they're so used to dealing with cash, there's also some skepticism with technology. And so, when you see a number in your phone, like the number of money you have, the amount of money you have in your phone, is different than the actual money you have, in your hand, right, under your
Yeah.
bed. That security level, they may have some of that. But I do think that it is changing. And certainly some countries have shown that you can make that change. You see China right now, for example, highly, highly digitalized. A lot of people have mobile phone. They use various types of apps. They transact in digital payments, and you see that as well in other locations. However, when you go to Japan, that also has an aging society, an aging population. You see high number of elderly population just comfortable
Yeah.
transacting in cash, even though there are a number of services that are available to them.
Is PayPal big in China or in China?
It is an important market for us,
Yeah.
and we want to continue to focus and grow our presence in China. Yeah.
'Cause I think isn't WePay is what most people use. Well, which I is that right? People dominantly people will use WePay or WeChat.
So
I don't. I
yeah,
should know
we
this, but
we WeChat and WeChat Pay is
WeChat
their
Pay.
payment platform. Well, certainly, I think the Chinese companies, Alipay
Mm,
and WeChat Pay, part of Tencent, is a dominant player
yeah.
in China's market, Chinese market.
What outside of finance and government regulations, what are you interested in? What other kinds of things do you, uh,
Yeah.
what other stuff do you read or pay attention to?
So certainly before COVID, I loved to travel, and so I travel extensively throughout the region, both for work, but also for pleasure, because they're just so rich in history, culture.
Oh,
Travel is cheap and quite accessible in the region. And as part of that, I do like to hike and explore various kind of old cities. There's a lot of great religious, just very rich religious sites
yeah.
throughout Asia Pacific, where there are 1,000-year Buddhist temples
Mm,
to 1,000-year, mosques.
mm,
Just a very diverse region here to travel, and so I enjoy that a lot. Aside from that, I do pay attention closely on the political development. I really enjoy reading up on political economy, politics, keep tracking of what's happening with the U.S. Political development and the implication for Asia Pacific, but also what's happening here as well. And being in the fintech space, of course, it's very exciting. And so, constantly monitoring the type of, the ecosystem and the type of new companies that are coming in, the shifting of market trends and consumer trends. It's a very exciting space. And it is, the right time to be in this area right now with such high focus on digitalization and
mm.
digital transformation.
Good for you. I totally echo your both passions really. I think politics is fascinating because it's so it impacts us so much as to the trajectory of all of us together on this earth flying around
Yeah.
space. It's like it kind of comes down to how do we collectively make decisions and how do we place values on different parts of life. And so it is just inherently so interesting. And I think visiting these places, these 1,000-year-old places, I'm jealous. I there's so many of these places I didn't get a chance to visit when I was living in Singapore. But when you go to somewhere place that's 1,000 years old, it just takes you back to what life must have been like back then. And I think about sometimes the value systems and the ways of life that people had back then that contrast to life today. And I I think most people generally view history as this progression towards better. We're better
Yeah.
today than we were back then, but I think we're different. I think we're better in some ways. We have technology in our hands that's, far greater than anyone could
Yeah.
imagine. But in many ways, we've lost something in the past. I think the community living, the central spirituality that people had clearly as they dedicated the resources to building these buildings. There's so much of that that I think could be brought back or resurrected in a good sense, in a positive sense. And so I'm very much inspired by these things.
Absolutely, and you're right. When we look at history, we often think about kind of linear, right? And that
Yeah.
because we are here today, it means that we have progressed more and that we must be better than the past. But if you look at, just traveling, for example, to Cambodia, the Siem Reap, the old what is the ruins?
Oh, in Cambodia?
Yeah, in Cambodia. I just it's escaped my mind, but they have a very complex irrigation system that was built hundreds of years ago, and it flows throughout the whole city. And so, and that was done, years back. And when I also traveled in the past in Latin America to the Mayan ruins as well, right? They have very complex structure in
Mm.
their town that allows for various water flow, agriculture, production. And so often we forget that these are very advanced even for those time. The other thing I wanted to mention is that I also very passionate around diversity and inclusion, and so I drive a lot of those initiatives in Asia Pacific for PayPal as well. Often, we think about diversity and inclusion, we don't also think about Asia, right? Because if you are of kind of a Asian race, what more diversity do you need? But there are actually a lot of uh, um, complex and nuanced as well. You have different religions. You
Mhm.
have even in different countries, they may seem to have dominant ethnic group. There are also lots of minority groups, and often history has seen a lot of um, different conflicts around these groups as well. And so how do you build a better and more diverse company in these regions where you have employees from different backgrounds? You have also urban and rural cultural differences as well, to create a more kind of a diverse workplace where everyone can bring their authentic self to work, but also feel like they're part of the team. And as a company, we want to reflect our customer base and our communities that we live in. So I drive a lot of those initiatives for my company, whether it's around disability issues, whether it's around LGBTQ plus issues, or making sure that there's gender diversity within the company. That's been very exciting to see PayPal on this journey of growth. When I joined the company 2, 3 years ago, it was just the beginning of that process. And in the US, it's much more mature with various groups and community partnerships, and able to be a part of that and building that engagement out has been very rewarding.
Yeah. And I think these two stories weave together. I mean, the idea of going to these places and seeing this way of life, and in Asia, like you said, it's more nuanced, right? There may be, everyone is Asian, but then there's different sects and different religions and different ways that people split each other up, because that's what
Yep,
people do. And when you see and you can understand how other people live and what value system they hold dear, and you can imagine yourself being born in that group, that tribe, that area, that religion, whatever it is, you immediately connect with those people. And any sort of stigma that was there, any bias or prejudice, it just kind of dissolves because it's meaningless. You
absolutely.
see them much closer to you as you otherwise would. So I think there should be, I think people from China should go to America, go to India. India should go to US, go to China. Like the people should connect. And if there was anything, I wish we could, the firewall is so unfortunate because it blocks people from connecting. And I think if people can connect and they can do TikTok together and they can pray together, they can build companies together, it's amazing. What more optimistic future for the human species could you imagine than everyone working together to build something amazing? So kudos to you, Stephen, for all the
Absolutely.
progress you made. I mean, you really are doing a significant part in a great company, but doing a great job at integrating the world, really. So Yeah, thanks for everything you've done, and thanks for your time today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise, thank you, and really, wish you all the best, and hopefully, travel will resume, and we'll be able to
Yeah,
perhaps have a beer together.
yeah, would love to. Would love to, man. Well, definitely stay in touch, and we'll hope to have you on another time too.
All right, take care. Thank you.